Hello and welcome. On behalf of the entire American Red Cross, I want to extend to each and every one of you a special warm welcome. We're here to celebrate all things Tolkien, to celebrate all things Middle Earth, to celebrate all things Lord of the Rings. And what better way to do so than by learning a little bit more about one of the most impactful areas of the law currently happening and having an impact across the world, and using one of the best franchises that's out there to help us better understand. My name is Thomas Harper. I'm the Senior Legal Advisor in International Humanitarian Law for the American Red Cross National Headquarters. And I have the privilege of leading this Council of IHL today. You're going to hear from three of my really great distinguished colleagues, Augustus Turner, Eric Schmitz, and Christian Jorgensen, all of whom are fit to be on any fellowship, but are going to play a key role here in helping us better understand IHL through the lens of Lord of the Rings. Now, before we get started, I have to tackle the big elephant in the room, and that's what is IHL? It has the word humanitarian in it. It often, in circles outside of international law attorneys, it gets mistaken for maybe human rights law on the international level, but that's not what it is. IHL, which is synonymous with the law of armed conflict, which is synonymous with the term the law of war, is a branch of international law. It's interrelated but separate and distinct from human rights law, but it operates during times of armed conflict. And the goal of IHL as a whole, all the treaties, all the customs of it, is to reduce suffering. It's to rein in the unchecked destruction and suffering that has all too often been the hallmark of warfare for time immemorial. And you see the definition of it there, broad brush. It's rules that seek to limit the destructive effects of armed conflict and reduce suffering. So when we put this event together, I got a lot of questions from Tolkien heads, from Lord of the Rings fans, about why Lord of the Rings? Why are you using this franchise, Tolkien's work, to intersect with IHL? And I want to briefly touch on that because it raised a very good point. On the left, you see a young Tolkien in the early 1900s as a young man, but flash forward just a few years, and Lieutenant Tolkien entered service in the British Army in 1916. And in particular, if you know your history, this was a critical period of time for not just the British Army, but the world as a whole, because World War I was raging. He entered in wartime service and almost immediately went to the front in France, and very soon after took part in one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war, the Battle of the Somme. It lasted 5 months. An unfathomable amount of casualties occurred. Tolkien himself lost two of his closest friends, members of his tea society from back home. It was the single bloodiest day for the British Armed Forces in history, never to be surpassed. It was just unfathomable, the amount of destruction and the amount of suffering that occurred during that battle alone. And Tolkien was right there in the middle of it. Tolkien witnessed the sort of suffering that IHL serves to protect. And he served during a war that predated many of the foundational IHL protections that exist today, that maybe wouldn't be developed until sometime after World War I, and in many cases because of the death and destruction wrought by that war. Now, Tolkien himself, if you know your Tolkien history, he abhorred the idea that Lord of the Rings was an allegory, a historical, thinly veiled comparison of his wartime service or World War I or any political event. It was fantasy. That was how he wrote it. That was how he intended it. He wasn't trying to send some subtle or not so subtle message about any current events or his own experience. But Tolkien as a man, Tolkien as a soldier, had those experiences in warfare, the experiences at the Somme, indelibly marked on his conscience. And you see much of that throughout the novels. I'm not here to tell you that Middle Earth is modeled by or after the battle lines of the Somme, but no doubt it served to inspire him in many ways. And this idea, this fight to preserve humanity, this fight to preserve the innocent that you see all too often throughout the Lord of the Rings novels and the films is echoed, and it's one of the core reasons why we're here today. So before we dive in further into Middle Earth, we have to start with a foundational topic, which is talking about the conflict as a whole. What kind of conflict is it? It seems weird to say that because it sounds like, well, war is war, right? Well, this conflict in particular has a type, and that matters very much when we consider what components of IHL, what treaties, what aspects of that body of law are operable and will guide our analysis going forward as we dive further into things. So when it comes to conflict, wars aren't all created the same. And I don't mean qualitatively how they're fought, that sort of thing. I mean, there are different types of conflict recognized within IHL. Now, IHL itself recognizes two types. Your first is going to be an international armed conflict, the IAC. This is your classic state versus state battle, your World War II. And it's between, as you see there, two or more states, nations, if you will, whatever definition you want to apply there, drawing on your political science or similar background. And you have to have, as importantly, a resort to armed force. Now, I would point out the use of the term armed conflict is really critical, and it's intentional. Law of war, that type of terminology gets thrown around, but the resort to armed force, the requirement to trigger an international armed conflict doesn't require a formal declaration of war. It doesn't require this classical sort of pop culture war that we often are familiar with. It requires, and that's important because we don't want nations, we don't want parties to an armed conflict sidestepping their obligations under IHL simply because they haven't formally declared a war, making that an awfully convenient way to do an end around the protections that IHL demands. So there's no requirement that the conflict lasts for a particular length. I mean, we're used to conflicts like World War II and others that stretch on for months, if not years, and are massive in scope. Under IHL, the trading of even a few bullets can be enough to trigger an armed conflict for purposes of enacting the protections that IHL provides. Now, your second type of conflict is a non-international armed conflict. So you have your IAC. This is a NIAC. We like our nice rhyming acronyms there. So different in scope. Think you're thinking internally here. International has that broad brush global scope. International is looking inward. Think of a civil war, for example. You have an armed group, and they have to have a degree of organization, and there's a body of analysis that goes into that. And that armed group has to be against a government force. It can be two armed groups of the sufficient degree of organization. And here, different from an IAC, you have to have a certain intensity to that conflict. NIACs aren't triggered by sporadic unrest, by a singular terrorist attack, by a riot in the streets over some internal issue. There has to reach that conflict has to reach a certain threshold in order to trigger a NIAC, and by extension, trigger the obligations and protections under IHL that exist for non-international armed conflicts. Well, why does classification matter? Why do we care if a war is a war and people are dying either way? Why does it matter? Well, under IHL, it very much does. Because under an IAC, you have triggered the full range of IHL protections, IHL treaties like Geneva and Hague, customary law, so these customs that have been brought about and have the same force of law because of decades upon decades of state practice and recognition. You have that full-throated body of IHL protections that are triggered by an IAC. On the other hand, a NIAC is much narrower in scope. You have, as you see there, unlike the full range there, you have a subset of it. You have the Geneva Convention's Common Article 3, you have customary law, and you have provisions within the Geneva Convention's additional protocol number 2. Now, there's a big difference between those two bodies. And in fact, close to 600 treaty rules are applicable to an international armed conflict that are not applicable or not found applicable to NIACs. And fewer than 30 of those treaty obligations are actually in operation during a NIAC. So there's a big gulf of difference in terms of the protections and the body of IHL, the scope of IHL that is in play. Well, let's turn to the War of the Ring. What kind of conflict is that now that we have the baseline in real world law? So you have the forces of Sauron versus the free peoples of Middle-earth. It's an epic showdown. On one side, you have the free peoples of Middle-earth represented here. Tolkien divides Middle-earth by races. And sorry, Gandalf, I just had to get at one of your beloved vices there. You also have a few hobbits sprinkled in, but I would submit to you that the free peoples, the races within Middle-earth, function much like states, much like nation states here in our world. And we're not going to do a class on nation state identity and whatnot, but it is useful to cover a few basic characteristics. And we use Gondor as an example. Now, Gondor has defined territory. It's politically sovereign. You see its beautiful capital in Minas Tirith there. It's considered independent by the other races, the other sects of men there. They respect that territory. It has a defined citizenry with their own armed forces. There you see the symbol of Gondor on the shield of the soldiers there. And they all fall under a recognized public administration, in this case, a monarchy led by eventually at the end of the trilogy, King Aragorn here. You also, outside of Gondor, I would point you to Return of the King, the film, and you have King Theoden, so the leader of the Rohan peoples. And he actually describes it. There's this scene where he's toasting the dead, toasting the fallen Rohan citizens that gave their lives in battle up to that point. And he refers to Rohan as a country very specifically. So it's fair to say that these free peoples, these races function that way. And it's only appropriate that I give Aragorn his adequate degree, his deserved degree of love. He's the character by which we all revolve our lives around. Now, Sauron's forces are a little bit different. Sauron's forces are different in composition. You have a collection of bad men, some mercenaries, different sects that have pledged their loyalty to Sauron. You have a whole bunch of orcs with faces that only an orc could love. You have Nazgul, which we'll talk about here in just a minute, but they're effectively a specialized fighting force. And then you have one very bad, terrible, no good wizard in Saruman. Now, those don't fit the same mold. Those sects, those components of his armies don't fit the same mold as, say, Gondor or Rohan, these other races on the free people side. But Mordor itself does. Mordor itself is recognized as a territorially distinct area. In fact, if you think back to the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring, talks about the last alliance of men and elves. They actually marched on Mordor, so they are entering the territory of Mordor to battle Sauron there. It is recognized as this sort of carved out area, and it's chosen very specifically because it's been segmented off from the rest of Middle-earth. It's shielded by these mountain ranges. In fact, Sauron's headquarters, if you will, his capital city is there in Barad-dûr. That's where his base of operations is. And Sauron has maybe self-styled himself as a lord, and albeit a dark one, and one who wants to take over the entire earth and bring a reign of darkness in. But it fits the same mold. And so I would submit to you that Sauron's forces through Mordor versus the free peoples, that's an international armed conflict. Those are states against each other, battling for the heart and soul of Middle-earth as a world. No different than World War II, no different than World War I, when nations went to battle to save democracy and freedom, et cetera, et cetera. So what does that mean? Well, let's think back to our classification rules there. It means that if this is an IAC, and I realize this is not an open and closed debate, we could probably debate for an hour over classification of Middle-earth, but that's what we're going to go with. is an IAC, it means that full range of treaty and customary law is in effect. So the full-throated body of IHL is in effect. And that has practical implications throughout the stories and the experiences that the characters have. I would single out Merry, Pippin, and Gandalf in particular, because they critically rely on some of these protections that are signatories of an IAC and signatories of the full body of IHL that an IAC triggers. First, all three of them find themselves as combatants at some point or another, and they rely in kind on the IHL protections afforded to combatants, things like combatant immunity, the ability to not be prosecuted for normal lawful acts conducted in warfare. They also, all three of them, share the same fate of being detained, being captured and held prisoner at some point. Gandalf we'll talk about in a bit, but Pippin and Merry at the hands of the Uruk-hai. And they critically rely on sets of protections, at least within the IHL framework, in terms of prisoners of war that we'll talk about in just a bit as well. So those protections are critical. They're core components of the body of IHL that's active in an IAC, and that's why it matters. It has a very practical effect. So let's move on and talk about something, at least for me, that I dork out about. I'm a big Star Wars fan, big Middle-earth fan, and I love the discussion of weaponry, all the crazy weaponry that exists in Middle-earth and elsewhere. And when we talk about weaponry, at least in the real world and in Middle-earth, we're talking about means and methods. Weaponry is are tools by which a war is fought, and that calls upon a specific body or a specific subset of IHL. Now, I want to focus in on one of the core foundational principles. There are four of them. One of the core foundational principles that pertains that undergird IHL, but that specifically pertain to weaponry and the means by which we are using weaponry to conduct warfare. Now, the principle is laid out there on screen, and it stands for the fact that the means and methods of warfare that are designed or intended to cause superfluous injury, unnecessary suffering, those are prohibited. IHL recognized that death itself, death and injury may be unfortunate and sometimes necessary means to an end when it comes to waging a war. IHL doesn't operate to outlaw all death and destruction in war, but to rein it in. But needless injury, excess injury, injury for the sake of injury, death for the sake of death, those are the things that IHL tries to rein in. And that injury for the sake of injury, injury for the sake of viewing cruelty or suffering on your opponent, that is what is outlawed by this core principle here. And I want to bridge the gap here by talking about the Nazgul, everybody's favorite hooded horse riders. They freaked me out when I first watched the Fellowship of the Ring as a kid, and to this day they give me the heebie-jeebies. So the Nazgul, to catch you up, the Nazgul are 9 former kings of men. They were given rings of power by Sauron, and those rings helped them acquire wealth. It helped them acquire great power, but the rings also slowly corrupted them. They eventually turned into wraiths. They're trapped somewhere between the living and the dead, and they become servants of Sauron. These dark servants who, in the Fellowship trilogy, they lead the hunt for the One Ring, carried by Frodo. And the Nazgul are led by the ultimate baddie, the Witch King of Angmar. He uses a specialized weapon, in fact, called the Morgul knife. And this is a great way to impart a little bit about unnecessary suffering. So the Morgul knife or Morgul blade, it's got a unique design. It's meant to break off in the victim. It's meant to poison the victim. That the tip of that blade, when it's stabbed into an opponent, actually breaks off, and it's designed to work its way to the victim's heart and ultimately turn them into a wraith. And in fact, they're on Weathertop during the Fellowship of the Ring. Frodo finds out exactly the devastating effects of this weapon as the Witch King stabs him, as you see here in the GIF, with the blade. It breaks off. It's treated as an incredibly serious wound for Frodo. In fact, only Elvish medicine can allow him to live. And even going far enough into the future in Return of the King, he can still feel that wound. He can still feel the tip of that blade in his body. It's a lingering effect. It's one that causes him a great deal of suffering. And it's one that if they had not been able to treat him properly, it would have turned him into a wraith, an unfathomable result for things. So think back to our definition. You talked about a design of a weapon or an intended use in terms of its unnecessary suffering. And a mortal blade is designed, its very purpose is to poison a victim, to inflict that suffering. It fits squarely within the prohibition under IHL. Nazgul themselves are the embodiment of darkness and cruelty, and that blade is an extension of it. It's quite literally meant to share and impart that same amount of suffering on the victims, both in that shard that breaks off in their heart or breaks off in their body and stays there, and in the awful fate that the victims suffer, becoming a wraith and forever being stuck in that nether region between life and death. I now want to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Augustus Turner, who's going to take us even further in Middle Earth. Augustus, over to you.
Hey, Thomas, can you hear me?
I can.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much for allowing me to join, and thank you all for joining us. It is such a pleasure to speak with you, and it's an honor to talk with you. I'm Augustus Turner. I've known Thomas for a couple of years, but we're former JAG officers, but I'm actually a lawyer for Amazon Prime Video. So it's really great to share this time with you and to talk with you about the next topic, which is actually going to be perfidy. And a lot of people ask, what is perfidy? It doesn't sound like a good thing. It doesn't sound like a good word, because it's not. Perfidy is treachery. Treachery is actually illegal under the laws of armed conflict. And so perfidy is actually, and the way I like to describe it is using the cover of peace to lure the enemy into a trap. Now, examples of perfidy include faking things such as the intent to negotiate, for example, luring someone into peace talks, for example, to talk peace, and then you suddenly kill the people who are there during peace negotiations. I'm sure we can all imagine fictitious and real examples of that in war. Another example is faking injuries, wounds, sickness. This is a very real illustration that played out many times during conflicts such as Vietnam, where dead soldiers were booby-trapped with claymore mines, for example. Another example is abusing protected symbols. Abusing a protected symbol could come in the form of disguised soldiers or special operators who disguise themselves as medical workers to infiltrate an objective, or putting a Red Cross symbol on a military vehicle and painting it white. Abusing a legally protected symbol to achieve a military objective. So turning to the fellowship and perfidy, Sauron, his special power, one of his main special powers, is perfidy. In fact, the fellowship was born on acts of perfidy, in large part. Obviously, there's a lot to go in to the foundation of the fellowship, but one of the there are two acts that I want to focus on today. The first is that Sauron disguised himself as a non-combatant. Now, this isn't, if you've watched the movies, you might not know this whole backstory, but if you read the books, you might, or if you're a fan of the full story, you might know this. But Sauron disguised himself as you'll obviously see on the left, he disguised himself as an elf. A peaceful, essentially a polar opposite of his true self, a peaceful elf named Anatar. And he used this disguise to infiltrate the world of men and elves and dwarves. In the same way, again, many soldiers, or you might see special operators who disguise themselves or abuse protected symbols to unlawfully infiltrate an objective. That is exactly what Sauron did here. The second act was that he abused the protected symbol. And this is one that all fans will probably be aware of and was alluded to previously by my friend Thomas. When Anatar had infiltrated the worlds of men and elves and dwarves, he created 19 magical rings. And these 19 magical rings he gave to all three sets of people. He gave 3 rings to the elves, 7 to the dwarves, and 9 rings to men. And as Thomas had mentioned before, these rings, on its face, these rings were very powerful. They gave great wealth. They gave immortality. By all accounts, these were gifts and peace offerings. However, they were not, as we all know. Sauron had actually made a more powerful ring at Mount Doom called the One Ring. The One Ring controlled anyone who wore the 19 magical rings. And so this is a perfect example and illustration of how perfidy works, not only in abusing a non-combatant status, but abusing protected symbols. Now, turning to another very, very famous character in our trilogy, we're going to talk about Gollum and how Gollum engages in perfidy. We're gonna fast forward a little bit. Obviously, we're gonna talk, depending on whether you're a fan of the books or whether you're a fan of the film series. The events I'm going to talk about occur somewhere between the Two Towers and the Return of the King. The specific act of perfidy that Gollum commits in this example I'm going to highlight is he abuses his non-combatant status. Now, some may say that essentially the entire trilogy, Gollum is abusing a non-combatant status, because throughout most of the series, Frodo and Sam believe that Gollum is friendly. In fact, that's why they allow Gollum to accompany them as they travel to take the One Ring to Mount Doom. The truth of the matter is, Gollum, as we all know, is actually not a non-combatant. Gollum is actually, he has many interests, but he is, in this example, he is a combatant, and he is working for a giant demonic spider named Shelob. Now, to understand how this works, how Gollum and Shelob, how Gollum is a combatant through Shelob, we have to go back. Go back, and I'll give you a little context. Long ago, long before the Fellowship began, Gollum was captured by Shelob, who was a giant, disgusting, demonic spider. Gollum made a deal with Shelob to secure his freedom. Gollum promised to bring Shelob future victims for Shelob to devour and eat. In exchange, Shelob would allow Gollum to have the remains or the valuables left behind by her victims. So, in many ways, Gollum, in this context, again, for fans of the series, we all know Gollum has many conflicting interests, but he is a combatant who is abusing his status. And so in this example, he isolates Frodo by essentially, falsely accusing Sam of eating up their rations and food, basically forcing, or not forcing, but compelling Sam and Frodo to split with Gollum. And then Gollum leads Frodo into Shelob's lair, where Shelob nearly kills Frodo. And in fact, the only reason why he isn't killed is because Sam saves his life and comes into the lair. So again, we see examples of how this plays out, and that perfidy is actually, it's treachery, and treachery is actually illegal under the laws of armed conflict. It's a strange proposition to think that they're in the concept of war, which involves mass destruction, in many cases, killing of others, that there has to be honor. That honor is part of the law, and we see that play out through these two examples. So next, we're going to talk about a somewhat uncomfortable but incredibly relevant issue in IHL, and that issue is very relevant here in modern times, and that is the issue of respect for and treatment of the dead. Now, the law of armed conflict requires those who perish as a result of an armed conflict to be handled respectfully. Their dignity protected, their identities confirmed, and specific examples in the law, it includes searching for them, for the dead, evacuating them, returning their remains and their personal effects, and also preventing despoilment. Now, we're going to talk about how this plays out in a lot of these principles will play out in one example, and that is near the beginning of the Two Towers, and that's with the Riders of Rohan. Now, near the beginning of this phase of the story, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli are searching for Merry and Pippin, their companions who were previously taken by the Uruk-hai. Now, the Riders of Rohan and their leader, who's pictured here, Éomer, informs the three riders that the riders had rode into the Uruk-hai camp the night before and essentially slaughtered everyone, killed everyone who was in the camp without any distinction for whether they were an enemy or not. Aragorn reminds Éomer that the hobbits might be there, and he tells them, were there children or child-sized people among the people who were killed? And you can see the reaction on Éomer's face as he realizes we didn't account for that. We just assumed everyone there was an enemy, and we killed everyone there. And they make it clear as well that they put all of the dead into a pile and burn them. And now in the story in the book, the fire is so big that the smoke rises up all the way to heaven. So with that sort of realization from Éomer, he gives the three hunters horses to be able to go to the mass grave and search for the bodies of their friends. Now, they do go there and they don't find Merry and Pippin there, but they do eventually locate them. However, the important point from this is that this highlights multiple aspects of the need to pay respect for the dead, and to search for, evacuate, return remains and personal effects, and prevent despoilment. It is even for the Riders of Rohan, who had just previously, or a few hours before running into the three hunters, they essentially wiped out a whole village. They also realized that even though they engaged in a massive battle where they killed everyone in sight, they also realized that they have to pay respect to the dead, and that includes searching for and preventing despoilment and honoring the dead in the proper way. That's why they donated those horses, despite killing everyone previously. So again, just like with Perfidy, the right way to say it is, it can be very strange to see these concepts play out. To the requirement to have honor, the requirement to not engage in trickery, even though there is a great temptation to do so, to ignore the dead after you've killed them after a great battle. But we see these conflicts and we see these principles play out throughout the trilogy. And so that is my piece for the presentation. I'm going to turn it now over to my good brother, Eric, who is going to carry you along in the fellowship. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you guys.
Hello, everybody. All right, thank you, Augustus. Well known for your heroics in the Battle of Dagorlad. So my name is Eric Schmitz. I'm the former Henry P. Davison Fellow here with the American Red Cross. I was primarily responsible for researching the effects of conflict on Middle-earth's vast woodlands, including my friends, the Ents. And we're pressed for time, so I may need to be hasty, but not too hasty. So I'm going to start by speaking about IHL's rules on detainee treatment during armed conflict. As has been discussed, the primary body of IHL is written in the provisions of the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and their additional protocols. The third Geneva Convention of 1949 governs the treatment of prisoners of war. And we're going to get a little bit more into that in a bit. One of the main principles that run through all sources of IHL, though, that govern detainee treatment is that said detainees should be treated humanely. And you can see here that we have Gandalf looking rather distressed, but we're going to get into that as well. So let's start with the rules. Now, there are numerous legal instruments in the canon of IHL that protects detainees during armed conflict, the most central of which is the Third Geneva Convention of 1949. So we've already established, thanks to the Right and Honorable Thomas Harper, that the War for the Ring is an IAC, International Armed Conflict. So the relevant law is the Third Geneva Convention. However, there are other sources of law that govern detainee treatment during armed conflict, including the Convention Prohibiting Torture, international customary law, it goes on. Focusing on the convention, though, you can see from the quote on the screen that the treatment of prisoners of war must be humane, causing death or seriously endangering the life of a POW is strictly prohibited. Other provisions of the convention get more specific about types of behavior that might be prohibited, access to medical treatment, quarters, quality of food, quality of quarters, all that. But the through line is humane treatment, don't cause death or serious endangerment of life. All right. So now getting to the first instance of an IHL violation in the Lord of the Rings pertaining to detainee treatment. And that's Sauron's treatment of Gandalf after what might be considered to be the most epic geriatric fight in cinematic history. After besting Gandalf in battle, Sauron takes Gandalf prisoner, ostensibly to convince him to switch sides in the battle for Middle-earth. However, Sauron's compliance with IHL has some problems. The scene we see here is where Sauron is preparing to send Gandalf to his rather lofty accommodations. But like any good corrupted wizard, he sort of starts giving a monologue about why he aligned himself with Sauron and why Gandalf failing to join him was an epic fail. Now, I get nauseous just looking at this GIF, so I apologize to any of you that might share that. But I'm not sure that this act, the act of just spinning him around, is a IHL violation. If it was, half the rides at Six Flags might have some Geneva Conventions issues. So throughout the series, books and movies, grave breaches of IHL pertaining to detainee treatment abound. Sauron's forces, from Saruman and the Nazgul down to your run-of-the-mill goblin, have little respect for the provisions of the Third Geneva Convention regarding the treatment of prisoners of war. Starting back with Gandalf, who's now located on the top of Orthanc, which is Saruman's tower, very tall tower, in his territory of Isengard. As somebody who's scared of heights, but I think more objectively also, this would violate Article 25 of the Third Geneva Convention, which governs proper quarters for detainees, amongst other provisions in the Third Geneva Convention, as well as the entire canon of IHL on detainee treatment. So then you have the whole, I'm going to magically hold you over the edge of the tower strategy. I am terrified of heights, but even if Gandalf doesn't share my fear of heights, and even if Gandalf did not have an army of eagles that seemingly owes him an endless set of favors, this would almost certainly be a violation of IHL. It's using mental anguish, intentionally using mental anguish as a means of extracting information or concessions is strictly prohibited. Additionally, you have Frodo here, who was taken prisoner at the Tower of Kirith Ungol after being wrapped up by Shelob like a breakfast burrito. And the prisoners, the orcs being the detainers, have an obligation to provide Frodo with food, suitable quarters, rather than sort of stripping him of all of his clothes and objects and threatening to torture, or not threatening, but all but guaranteeing to torture and kill him. So I just want to make one quick note here as we wrap up detainee treatment that not only the bad guys commit breaches of IHL. Frodo and Sam capture Gollum, they tie him up and they carry him on a leash. Not what I would consider to be humane. Sam even suggests tying him to a rock and leaving him, which would kill us. Now I could name you, we could go through provisions that this would violate from the Third Geneva Convention, the Convention on the Torture Convention, but we don't have all day. So I just wanted to note that the good guys commit war crimes too. Next, I wanted to talk about the protections for the environment during armed conflict and the destruction of the environment during the War for the Ring. Starting again with the rules, there are numerous instruments of IHL and international law more generally that can be considered to touch upon environmental protection. They are totally deficient in most cases, in my opinion, but that's neither here nor there. In IHL, though, there are two main legal instruments that carry a significant provision or two that address environmental protections. They are Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions of 1949, the additional protocol being ratified in 1977, and the Convention on the Prohibition of Military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques, most commonly known as, and known as will go forward, as the NMOD Treaty. The relevant provisions of both treaties contain pretty similar language in prohibitions on the widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the environment. The difference is that the Additional Protocol 1 protects the environment as a victim of armed conflict. The NMOD Treaty protects the environment from being used as a weapon in armed conflict. So those are the key differences, and we're going to go through some of the scenarios in the Tolkien verse now. So in Lord of the Rings, Saruman takes pretty much a commanding role in environmental destruction. It could actually be argued that his actions would violate both Additional Protocol 1 and NMOD. Here, Saruman suggested that his orc soldiers burn down the trees of Fanghorn Forest in order to build his army. If you survey the damage caused by Saruman's machinations in trying to wipe out the kingdom of Rohan, which we spoke about before, that's viewed as a strategic target to eventually conquering Gondor. I would argue that this is a violation of the NMOD Treaty, using the destruction of Fanghorn Forest in order to sort of build an army. Additionally, Saruman's forces destroyed and burned both Fanghorn Forest, and all the lands of Rohan. There are actually witnesses of Saruman giving these orders to burn everything, which would undoubtedly cause widespread, long-term, severe damage to the environment of Rohan and Middle-earth. So any Middle-earth tribunal that I've ever heard of would probably find him in grave breach of Article AP1, which Article 55, which is the specific article referencing environmental protections. Now, as you can see, Saruman gets his comeuppance as the Ents, my buds, the Ents, strike back. Now, some may say, particularly by releasing the dam, the Ents are committing a violation of IHL, modifying the environment. My argument would be absolutely not. The river really didn't cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to Isengard because Sauron had already turned it into basically an Uruk-hai incubating facility. So I don't think that would pass muster. Okay, next, let's get to the big guy, Sauron. I don't want to get too deep into the Lord of the Rings Silmarillion lore here, but Sauron is what's called a Maiar spirit, basically the same as the wizards, who are also Maiar spirits. They're sort of like, in the Tolkien universe, like low-level angel type things, and magic kind of comes naturally to him. He doesn't need to use a wand or a staff. And one thing he's able to do is to use Mount Doom to cover all the land in darkness using poisonous gas. Not unlike the environment in Mordor that has inspired all of our favorite Sean Bean Boromir memes. Gandalf even says in the very beginning of the Fellowship when he's talking to Frodo, he wants to cover the land in sick darkness. And you sort of see that here. You see it in Mordor. You sort of see it going forward, and I'll get to that in a second. Sauron uses this poisonous cloud and gas to cover to cover the Pelennor Fields, the area between Mordor and Gondor's capital, Minas Tirith. This is, to facilitate the Nazgul and the other forces crossing those fields and attacking Minas Tirith. I would argue this is a clear violation of the Enmod Treaty. While Sauron was defeated, which had the effect of clearing the air, had he not been defeated, his poisonous gas would have likely covered all of Middle Earth, or as far as Middle Earth as he was able to dominate, which would cause our three favorite terms for damage to the environment: severe, widespread, long-term, and severe. And with that, I would like to pass it over to my colleague, Christian Jorgensen, who we're very lucky to hear from because he is on his way to the Grey Havens to catch a ride to the Undying Lands. So Christian, it's really great for you to be here with us today and on your way there.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. There we go. Yeah, so my name is Christian Jorgensen. I work at the American Red Cross. And I'm really happy to be here. This has probably been my favorite event that we've ever hosted. I grew up loving Tolkien, and I grew up loving Lord of the Rings. So it's been an absolute pleasure, having the chance to study that and prepare for work. Before I move on to my section, I want to give a shout out to the Tolkien Society. I know they helped us promote this event. So I do want to encourage everyone, if you're interested in Tolkien and all the great works that he's done, please go visit them at their website and see all the great work that they do as well. All right, so we're going to be talking about protecting Middle Earth civilians. Before I get started, I want to say civilians it's a label. Like, law focuses on labels. We do that in society all the time. I have a label. It happens to be Christian. And we have to really look behind, like, what does that label actually mean? And Tolkien as a writer was great about this. Sometimes, like, people always say that Tolkien's words were specifically chosen, like you did not change them because they were chosen for a specific reason. Like Frodo, for example, comes from the Old English word for Frode, which means wise. Even Samwise means, like, well, technically you could say it means foolish based on its etymology, but you could also say that it means half wise, maybe possibly the second half of the person named wise. So there's a lot of power behind labels. That's my main point. And Tolkien was just a genius behind making something seem creative, but really, if you look at it, you can tell that there was a hidden meaning behind it. And the law does the same thing. Like, we label people civilians in law, and there's a specific definition. Even the Department of Labor has a definition of who constitutes a civilian, and IHL is no different. So before I begin, I want to say that, the law in IHL defines a civilian as anyone who's not a member of the armed forces, and also refers to that as being anyone who refrains from any act of hostility. I'm not really going to get into the nuances in my discussion about the latter part of that, because, like law, there's always, an extra piece to it, which for some can be annoying. For lawyers, we can always nerd out about it. But today we're going to talk about just the civilians. I want you to think about them as the men and women that you see fleeing, like all the people from Rohan going to Helm's Deep in the film, all the innocent people at the Shire, etc. So keep that in mind. That's how IHL defines civilians, and it does so particularly on purpose because, all right, let me see if I can click next. There we go. So, and it does so in three ways. So there's Geneva Convention 4. I wanted you guys to refer to this because one thing I wanted to add is, like I said, labels matter. And if you want to know more about these labels, you got to usually do a little bit of extra research. So there's lots of great places out there. Go to the ICRC's website to learn more about basically anything you hear surrounding armed conflict. And there's going to be a plethora of stuff to help you understand, like, why that word is specifically being used, what it means, and how it's applied to armed conflict. But anyways, for civilians, when you have that label on the battlefield, it's telling the parties to that conflict that these people are protected from the acts that you are going to, take on each other. And that's the legal obligation that you've agreed upon if you're going to go to war. You have to do that. That comes from Geneva Convention 4, Article 13, but also Additional Protocol 1, Article 52, Additional Protocol 1, Article 87, even go on to this. It obligates commanders to make sure that their forces know, like, people who have the label civilian, that's what this means, can't do it. That's the meaning of civilian. but also Article 52, you have to also protect the objects. So the law even talks about people as civilian, but also objects as civilians as well, civilian as well. And you're not supposed to take any direct, indiscriminate attacks on those people. So that means like an offensive type attack. You know, even the word attack has a legal definition as well. But one thing I wanted to talk about now, tied into the Lord of the Rings, is, you know, when I was studying for this, I realized that there are so many instances in this story, and I'm going to acknowledge that, you know, it is a story. So I'm not trying to send anyone to the gallows or anything like that. But anyways, my point is that Sauron orders his troops multiple times to basically burn all the villages. Here you see the Dunlendings basically being ordered to burn all the villages. Well, those would be the civilian objects. So not really being a good commander there by ordering them to directly attack civilian objects. We see that in the bottom picture there. But then also, if you remember in the movie, at least, he gives this big speech in front of 10,000 people. And that 10,000 crowd, he says, leave no survivors. Well, we already know that Helm's Deep is full of civilians, and he's basically ordering them to attack civilians. So once again, you know, those are innocent people. Those objects are there for, they don't serve any military purpose. Don't make war more inhumane and more destructive than it needs to be. That's what the law is trying to do here. So, you know, as a lawyer, that's how I think about it. I open that book and I really read into the words. I think about all the labels. Just like next time you open a Tolkien book, like each time you hear a word and you think it's just creative, I guarantee you there's a hidden meaning behind that name or that word, why it was said. I will say sometimes they're made up, but even those made up languages, he eventually gives them, you know, definitions as well. All right, so the last thing I'm going to talk about is the Battle of Isengard. And I'm going to do this as like Fanghorn Forest, with the combatants being the Ents and the Hurons in the book, and the Isengard army, you know, led again by Saruman. Most of the people in that army have left to go to Helm's Deep at this point, but there's still some people there, and we could label them combatants. We're not going to label them civilians. But what I do want to focus on is, once again with labels, Isengard. Isen is the river that Eric was referring to. It has another name as well, but even Tolkien went further and called it Isengard. Guard comes from an Old Norse word. I think it's still the word in Swedish for like courtyard. So if you look at a picture of Isengard, you can see like a big wall around it, right? So like that's the territory of Isengard. So like fun fact there. But even in the movie, we see Isengard change. Like we see it as being like a peaceful place. Then we see it basically turn into the entirety of that thing behind the guard, or the court in the courtyard, has become now like a military factory. And then eventually what I'm going to focus on is kind of continue on with what Eric's talking about, which is this flooding. So when I was watching the movie and I was thinking about things to talk about, there's that scene where they destroy the dam. And I remember hearing something in IHL that talked about there's a prohibition on the destruction of dams and dikes and nuclear electrical generating facilities. And so, like I said, I went to those many sources and I opened it up and I wanted to learn, like, what does the law say about this? So basically, Additional Protocol 1, Article 56, basically prohibits the destruction of these types of facilities, and specifically names dams. And then my question was, all right, so were the acts of the Ents unlawful? And I'm gonna probably get a lot of flack from Eric on this, because I don't want to ever put the Ents actions under question, but he did say even the good do bad things. So we got to be fair how we analyze this. So it says those are going to be protected, but you always have to keep reading, just like a story. You don't just stop where you want it to stop. That's not how law works. That's not how stories work. And it continues. Well, if it's going to cause, if it unleashes a force that causes, you know, destruction and death to civilians. All right, so let's pretend there's civilians there. Well, that would make what the Ents did unlawful. But the law doesn't stop there. The story's not finished. It even goes a step further, and it says in the second part of Article 56, it says it can lose that protection if it is used other than its normal function and it's in direct support of military operations. So if the Ents were having like a legal analysis party, not that that sounds fun to everyone else, but it says something like, you know, where we know that they're using this dam to support their military industry in there. Well, then maybe that loses its prohibition. But let's say that the last thing that the Ents can do, and if you read the book, the battle actually takes 3 days, and they go back and realize this is the last thing that they can do, and they think it's going to work, is to destroy the dam, and it will basically flood the entire part of Isengard. And so again, attack is the only feasible way to end that military support for the enemy in that certain battle. So maybe it's lawful in that case. But like I said, if there are civilians there, that's when this law comes into effect. If it's just a military object and it's just a dam, there's no need to consider civilians, which in most real life cases there always is. You don't really need to do this analysis, but that's how it would work. You know, you have to look at what the law says, and then you look to see if there's any exceptions to the law. So I hope I've been able to use Lord of the Rings to help you learn how we apply IHL and how we think about IHL. And the person, that's a good comment. Holly said it might take too long. Those are all laws based on facts. So with that, I'll let it go. But I'm happy to take questions.
Well, I've jumped all the way back to the start of the slides again. Here we go. Thank you, everybody. Thanks to Augustus, Eric, and Christian for doing a phenomenal job helping educate, helping use Lord of the Rings as a tool to educate everyone here on a really critical topic. Ukraine isn't the only armed conflict being waged around the world, but it is one that is dominating the headlines, no doubt. My hope, our hope collectively as the American Red Cross, is that you can use some of these lessons to better understand events like that are happening, that are coming before your eyes every single day in the news, but also to go back and have some fun with it. Go back and rewatch Lord of the Rings. Think about these things in a different way. I guarantee you'll go back and you'll watch the scenes around Isengard and the battle with the ensign. You're going to be thinking Enmod. You're going to be thinking about their actions with the dam there. So we are a volunteer-based organization. Our full-time team is small here at national headquarters, but you can get involved as an IHL volunteer doing the work of helping educate your fellow Americans, your classmates, your coworkers, your community members, family members in your own community. We do a lot of this fun stuff with IHL and pop culture. It's a great way, as I said, to put a lens on these things. But we also do a lot of great other educational events, and they're all driven by volunteers like many of you. So if you have an interest, our contact is down there, including my direct email. Reach out to us. We'll let you know about what opportunities there are and how you can get involved and make an impact in this field in your own community. Even if you're not a lawyer, even if you have no legal training, even if you have no prior knowledge of IHL, there is no bar to entry for this. Everyone is welcome, and we'd love to have you on our extended team. I want to thank all of you. To those of you who are going to give the Rings of Power a shot, that debuts tonight. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. But in any event, if it's not, then fire up Fellowship's extended edition and maybe dedicate the next 9 to 12 hours to those extended editions, and just be thinking IHL while you watch it. Thanks to everyone for coming, and we'll see you next time.